The annual harvest festival at St. Bartholomew's Church in the village of Mill Haven had always struck Miss Jane Marple as a peculiar mixture of genuine thanksgiving and barely concealed social warfare. As she settled into her usual seat near the back of the church hall, her knitting bag arranged carefully beside her, she reflected that few events revealed the true nature of village life quite so clearly as an evening where everyone was expected to be grateful and charitable in equal measure. The hall glowed warmly under the soft light of dozens of candles that Mrs. Beatrice Thornfield, the vicar's wife, had insisted upon for authentic atmosphere. Electric lights, she had declared with the authority of someone who had once lived in London, were far too harsh for such a traditional celebration. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the faces of the assembled villagers, creating an almost theatrical quality that seemed to encourage confidences and conceal secrets in equal measure. Miss Marple's keen eyes moved methodically around the room, noting the small dramas that always played out beneath the surface of village politeness. Near the harvest display, Mr. Geoffrey Hartwell, the recently retired bank manager, stood in earnest conversation with Mrs. Vivian Cross, the sharp-tongued proprietress of the village tea-room. Their voices were carefully modulated, but their body language spoke of disagreement and, Miss Marple thought, a certain desperation on Mr. Hartwell's part. Mrs. Cross kept glancing toward the entrance as though expecting someone, and when she shook her head at whatever Mr. Hartwell was proposing, her usually immaculate composure showed distinct cracks. At the head table, Colonel Pemberton regaled his neighbors with another of his military anecdotes, but Miss Marple observed that his wife's attention was entirely focused on a woman sitting alone near the vestry door. The stranger was perhaps 45. Elegantly dressed in a way that suggested London rather than rural England, and she had been staying at the Lamb and Flag for the past week without explanation. Most intriguingly, several of the village's most prominent citizens seemed acutely aware of her presence, though none had acknowledged her directly. Dr. Sarah Pemberton, the village's capable physician, moved through the crowd with her usual professional confidence, but Miss Marple noted how she carefully avoided the strangers' section of the hall. Young Eleanor Vance, the vicar's ethereal niece who had been visiting for the past month, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the candles with an intensity that suggested she was seeing something quite different from dancing flames. The Reverend Timothy Blackwood, a man whose sermons had grown increasingly passionate since his wife's death 2 years prior, rose to offer the traditional blessing. His voice carried clearly through the hall, but Miss Marple detected an underlying tremor that spoke of more than mere ceremony. As he spoke of community bonds and the importance of truth, his eyes kept drifting to the mysterious London woman, and his hands gripped the lectern with unnecessary force. "We gather tonight not merely to celebrate the harvest," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "but to acknowledge that sometimes the past refuses to remain buried, and that truth, like the grain we have gathered, must eventually come to light." The words hung in the air with unusual weight, and Miss Marple noticed how several people shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Cross had gone quite pale, Mr. Hartwell was staring fixedly at his hands, and even the usually unflappable Mrs. Thornfield seemed disturbed by her husband's departure from the traditional blessing. It was then that the stranger rose from her seat. She moved with quiet dignity toward the front of the hall, and as she did so, a hush fell over the assembled villagers. When she spoke, her voice was clear and carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. 25 years ago, she said, my sister Catherine Mills disappeared from this village. The official investigation concluded that she had left of her own accord, but I have never believed that to be true. I have returned because I believe someone in this room knows what really happened to her. The silence that followed was profound. Miss Marple observed how the candlelight seemed to flicker more intensely, casting shifting shadows across faces that had suddenly become masks of careful neutrality. But masks, she had learned over the years, often revealed more than they concealed. Mrs. Cross had risen half from her chair before sinking back down. Mr. Hartwell's face had taken on a grayish pallor that made him appear suddenly much older. Dr. Pemberton had moved closer to the wall, positioning herself where she could observe the room without being easily observed herself. "My name is Margaret Mills Ashford," the woman continued. "I'm a barrister, and I have spent considerable time investigating my sister's disappearance. I believe the time has come for the truth." Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, his face a study in conflicting emotions. "Mrs. Mills Ashford, perhaps this is not the appropriate—" "There will never be an appropriate time," she interrupted gently but firmly. Catherine was 23 when she vanished. She had been working as a governess for the Hartwell family, and she had recently become engaged to a young man from the village. She was happy, Reverend. She had no reason to simply disappear. Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small movement near the vestry door. Eleanor Vance had risen and was moving quietly toward the back of the hall, her face white as parchment. But it was not Eleanor's movement that held Miss Marple's interest. It was the way Mrs. Cross's eyes followed the young woman with an expression of barely controlled panic. The candles flickered as a draught moved through the hall, and in that moment of shifting light and shadow, a voice spoke from somewhere near the harvest display. The words were barely above a whisper, but in the profound silence they carried clearly to every corner of the room. "I can't bear it any longer. God help me, I did it." The confession hung in the air like smoke from the candles, and Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of recognition that came when a case began to reveal its true nature. But even as heads turned and voices began to rise in shocked murmur, she noticed something that others missed, the way the candlelight caught the edge of something metallic behind the harvest display, and how a dark stain on the stone floor near the vestry door reflected the flickering flames with a wetness that had nothing to do with spilled communion wine. The harvest festival had just become something far more serious than a celebration of autumn's bounty. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and prepared to observe very carefully indeed, for she had learned that when people confessed to murder in the dark, the truth was often far more complex than it initially appeared. In the dancing candlelight, with shadows moving like guilty secrets across the ancient walls of St. Bartholomew's, the real harvest was about to begin. The whispered confession hung in the candle-lit air like incense, heavy and inescapable. In the profound silence that followed, Miss Marple observed the curious phenomenon of collective shock transforming into individual calculation. Each face in the flickering light revealed not just surprise, but the rapid mental adjustments people make when a long-held secret suddenly shifts the foundation of their carefully constructed world. Geoffrey Hartwell stood frozen near the harvest display, his face the color of old parchment. His mouth worked soundlessly, and when he finally managed to speak, his voice cracked like autumn leaves. Yes, I said it. God help me, I couldn't keep it inside any longer." His confession, now openly claimed, sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the assembled villagers, but Miss Marple noted something peculiar in his manner. Relief mingled with confusion, as though he were surprised by his own words. Mrs. Beatrice Thornfield, ever practical even in crisis, began methodically extinguishing the more precarious candles, while her husband moved toward Hartwell with pastoral concern. But it was Colonel Pemberton who took decisive action, striding to the harvest display and sweeping aside the carefully arranged sheaves of wheat and decorative gourds. Behind the seasonal abundance lay a polished sickle, its crescent blade catching the remaining candlelight and revealing a dark stain along its edge that was decidedly not rust. "That's blood," Dr. Sarah Pemberton announced with clinical certainty, moving closer to examine the implement without touching it. Her professional composure masked what Miss Marple recognized as deep personal unease, particularly when her gaze drifted toward the vestry door where a small pool of something dark gleamed wetly on the ancient stones. The discovery of potential evidence galvanized the gathering. Mrs. Vivian Cross, who had maintained her position near the refreshment table throughout the evening's drama, suddenly gripped the linen tablecloth so tightly her knuckles went white. Her usual sharp confidence had evaporated, replaced by something approaching fear. When she spoke, her voice carried none of its customary authority. "Geoffrey was always so fond of Catherine," she said, the words tumbling out as though she couldn't control them. "Perhaps too fond. We all saw how he looked at her." Margaret Mills Ashford, the catalyst for the evening's revelations, moved through the crowd with the measured pace of someone accustomed to courtrooms and careful questioning. Her legal training was evident in how she observed reactions rather than participating in the growing speculation. When she paused near Hartwell, her voice carried quiet authority. "Mr. Hartwell, a confession is a serious matter. Are you certain you understand what you're saying?" Hartwell's response was barely audible. "Catherine she was going to tell everyone. About the money. About what I'd done at the bank. I couldn't let her ruin me." His words carried the weight of 25 years of guilt, but Miss Marple detected something troubling in his confession. It felt rehearsed, as though he were reciting lines learned long ago rather than speaking from immediate memory. The arrival of Constable Miller, red-faced and overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he faced, brought a semblance of official procedure to the chaos. He was quickly joined by Sergeant Peterson from the district headquarters, whose experienced eye immediately focused on the blood-stained sickle and the evidence of violence near the vestry door. As the two officers began securing the scene and taking preliminary statements, Miss Marple noticed a significant absence. Eleanor Vance, the vicar's ethereal niece who had been present throughout Margaret's dramatic announcement, was nowhere to be seen. More tellingly, a small square of pale silk lay crumpled near the vestry threshold, a handkerchief embroidered with a delicate E that Mrs. Thornfield immediately identified as Eleanor's. The young woman's disappearance, combined with the physical evidence of her presence at what appeared to be a crime scene, added another layer of complexity to an already tangled situation. As the villagers buzzed with theories and speculation, their earlier shock crystallizing into the comfortable certainty that Hartwell's guilt explained everything, Miss Marple remained quietly observant. She noted how Mrs. Cross avoided looking toward the vestry door, how Dr. Pemberton's professional examination of the evidence seemed to carry personal significance, and how Reverend Blackwood's pastoral concern for Hartwell was tinged with something that looked remarkably like relief. The harvest moon continued to shine through the tall windows of St. Bartholomew's, casting silver light across a scene that had transformed from celebration to crime scene in the space of a whispered confession. But Miss Marple had learned that in matters of murder, the most obvious explanation often concealed more complex truths, and Geoffrey Hartwell's ready admission of guilt raised more questions than it answered. In the dancing shadows of the ancient church, with the scent of candle wax and autumn harvest mingling with something darker, the real investigation was only just beginning. The church hall transformed into something resembling a crime scene, though Sergeant Peterson's methodical approach suggested he considered the case largely solved. Miss Marple remained in her wobbling chair, knitting bag untouched, observing how quickly the villagers had arranged themselves around Geoffrey Hartwell's confession like pieces on a chessboard. Yet something in the arrangement troubled her. The moves seemed almost too neat, too convenient for such a complex game. Dr. Sarah Pemberton knelt beside the dark stain near the vestry door, her medical training evident in the careful way she examined the evidence without disturbing it. "This blood is fresh," she announced quietly to Sergeant Peterson, her voice carrying the authority of professional certainty. "Within the hour, I'd estimate. Certainly not 25 years old." The implication hung heavy in the candle-lit air. Whatever had happened tonight was separate from Catherine Mills's long-ago disappearance, yet somehow connected to Hartwell's tortured confession. Mrs. Vivian Cross had abandoned her post at the refreshment table, moving restlessly through the hall with the jerky movements of someone fighting internal panic. When she paused near Mrs. Thornfield, who was methodically extinguishing the more dangerous candles, her usually sharp voice carried an uncharacteristic tremor. "Geoffrey always seemed so respectable. she said, the words tumbling out as though she couldn't control them. Though I suppose one never really knows what secrets people carry. Catherine was such a lovely girl. Engaged to young Thomas Whitmore, wasn't she? Such a tragedy when that ended so abruptly. The mention of Thomas Whitmore drew sharp looks from several villagers, and Miss Marple noted how Dr. Pemberton's examination of the bloodstain faltered momentarily. Mrs. Thornfield, ever the repository of village knowledge, nodded gravely. Poor Thomas left just days before Catherine disappeared. Never did understand why the engagement ended so suddenly. They seemed devoted to each other. Reverend Blackwood moved among his parishioners with pastoral concern, but Miss Marple observed something else in his manner, a relief so profound it was almost palpable. When Constable Miller approached him about securing the vestry, the vicar's response was telling. "Of course, Constable, though I'm afraid the spare key seems to be missing from the vicarage. Perhaps we should force the door?" The suggestion came too quickly, too eagerly for someone genuinely concerned about church property. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a detail others had overlooked in their focus on the dramatic confession. A thin trail of pale wax droplets led from the harvest display toward a small side door near the organ. Drops spaced unevenly, as when someone walks quickly with an unsteady light. The candles Mrs. Thornfield had provided were all beeswax, burning clear and clean, but these droplets had the opaque, crumbly texture of household tallow. "Someone brought their own candle," she murmured to herself, following the trail with her eyes. The implications were intriguing. Why would anyone need additional light in a hall already well illuminated for the festival? Unless, of course, they had planned to venture somewhere the official candles didn't reach. The sound of splintering wood drew everyone's attention as Constable Miller and the blacksmith's boy forced open the vestry door. What they revealed sent a collective gasp through the assembled villagers. The small room showed clear signs of a struggle: overturned chairs, scattered papers, and most significantly, a smear of fresh blood on the iron latch at roughly waist height. Caught in the splintered door frame was a small tuft of grey material that fluttered in the draught like a guilty secret finally exposed. Margaret Mills Ashford, her barrister's training evident in how she observed rather than speculated, moved closer to examine the evidence. "This suggests a recent altercation," she said carefully. "But Mr. Hartwell has been in plain sight all evening. How does this physical evidence align with his confession about events 25 years ago?" The question hung in the air like incense, and Miss Marple watched the faces around her with renewed interest. Mrs. Cross had gone quite pale and was staring fixedly at the grey material in the doorframe. Dr. Pemberton's professional composure showed cracks of what looked remarkably like personal distress. Most tellingly, several people glanced toward the side door near the organ, as though suddenly remembering something they'd rather forget. Outside in the churchyard, Eleanor Vance crouched behind the ancient yew tree, one hand pressed tightly to her side, where something warm and wet seeped through her fingers. The handkerchief she dropped in the vestry had been her second. The first was now sodden against her ribs. She could hear voices calling her name, see lantern beams sweeping the darkness, but she remained frozen in her hiding place, repeating like a prayer, "This isn't his fault. If I say it, it will be true." Back in the church hall, as Sergeant Peterson began organizing a more thorough search for Eleanor, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that Geoffrey Hartwell's confession, however genuine his remorse might be, represented only the surface of a much deeper truth. The fresh blood, the missing girl, the trail of tallow wax and the grey material in the vestry door all pointed to events far more recent and complex than a 25-year-old murder finally confessed. In the flickering candlelight of St. Bartholomew's, with autumn's harvest transformed into evidence of violence, Miss Marple prepared to look beyond the obvious answers, toward the uncomfortable truths that small communities often buried deeper than any grave. Sergeant Peterson surveyed the church hall with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had solved a 25-year-old murder in a single evening. Geoffrey Hartwell sat hunched in a chair near the altar, his confession having transformed him from respected village resident to suspected killer in the space of a whispered admission. Yet as Peterson began taking formal statements, Miss Marple observed something troubling in Hartwell's responses. They carried the vague, rehearsed quality of someone reciting lines rather than recalling genuine memories. "The details are hazy," Hartwell repeated when pressed about Catherine Mills's death. "It was so long ago. I remember the argument, the terrible moment when I lost control, but the specifics—" He trailed off, his hands trembling not with the relief of confession but with genuine confusion, as though he couldn't quite understand how his words had unleashed such chaos. Margaret Mills Ashford, her legal training evident in every carefully chosen word, challenged the convenient narrative taking shape around them. "Sergeant Peterson, you have a confession to a crime allegedly committed 25 years ago. Yet Dr. Pemberton has confirmed the blood in the vestry is fresh. Within the hour. Eleanor Vance disappeared tonight after violence occurred tonight. How does Mr. Hartwell's historical confession explain these immediate facts?" Peterson's irritation was palpable. "Coincidence, madam, or perhaps the young lady witnessed something that threatened to expose him. These cases often have complications." But Miss Marple had learned that in matters of murder, such convenient explanations rarely held water under careful examination. She rose from her chair and made her way toward the harvest display, her keen eyes following a detail others had dismissed. The trail of wax droplets leading from the display toward the organ door was not the clear, golden residue of Mrs. Thornfield's carefully chosen beeswax candles, but the opaque, crumbly remnants of household tallow, the sort of cheap candle one might bring for clandestine purposes. Someone required additional light for a task the festival candles couldn't illuminate, she murmured to herself, following the trail to where it ended at a side door that would allow discreet exit from the building. The implications were intriguing. Why would anyone need to move secretly through a well-lit church hall unless they were engaged in something they preferred to keep hidden? The gray material caught in the vestry door frame continued to puzzle her as well. Constable Miller had claimed it came from the struggle, but Miss Marple noted how the wood splinter holding it was fresh and pale, suggesting the fabric had been caught when the door was forced rather than during any earlier altercation. More tellingly, the material was fine wool, not the rough tweeds typically worn by village residents. Dr. Sarah Pemberton's voice carried clearly from the churchyard, directing the search for Eleanor with medical authority, but Miss Marple observed through the windows how the good doctor systematically steered searchers away from the dense yew grove where someone might genuinely hide. When Mrs. Thornfield suggested checking behind the Blackwood family monument, Dr. Pemberton quickly redirected attention toward the more open areas near the church gates. The discovery, when it came, arrived with Dr. Pemberton's urgent return to the hall, her professional composure finally cracking. "We need an ambulance immediately," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of genuine medical emergency. "Eleanor has been found behind the old yew, but she's lost considerable blood from a clean cut to her side. She's conscious but weak, and she keeps repeating something about protecting someone from the truth." This revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the evening's events. Eleanor's injury was real and recent, occurring during the festival while Hartwell sat under everyone's observation. Yet when brought inside on an improvised stretcher, the pale young woman's first words were directed at the accused man with unexpected tenderness. "You're not a bad man, Mr. Hartwell," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of concerned villagers. "You're just frightened. This isn't your fault." Hartwell's response was a shuddering sigh that spoke of relief and confusion in equal measure. "I wanted to tell the truth," he managed. "I thought if I spoke about the past, perhaps the present might remain hidden." Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Margaret Mills Ashford. Here was the crux of the matter. Hartwell's confession was genuine in its remorse, but false in its specifics, a desperate attempt to draw attention away from more recent and more dangerous truths. Someone had orchestrated tonight's violence to coincide with Margaret's investigation, using the harvest festival and its symbolic sickle as theatrical props in a carefully staged deception. As Eleanor was prepared for transport to hospital, still murmuring protective words about unnamed others, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's true lesson. In her experience, when the past and present collided so dramatically, the collision was rarely accidental. Someone in St. Bartholomew's had very good reasons for wanting Catherine Mill's disappearance to remain a closed book, and they had proven tonight that they would go to considerable lengths to keep it that way. The harvest moon continued its silent watch over Mill Haven, illuminating a mystery that had grown far more complex than a simple confession could resolve. The ambulance's departure left behind a peculiar silence that seemed to amplify every whisper and footstep in the ancient church hall. Miss Marple remained quietly observant, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision while her sharp eyes catalogued the subtle changes in behavior that often followed moments of crisis. She had learned over the years that people revealed their true nature, not in dramatic confessions, but in the small, unguarded moments when they believed themselves unobserved. Dr. Sarah Pemberton returned from seeing Eleanor off, her professional composure intact, but her movements betraying an underlying tension. When Sergeant Peterson questioned her about the young woman's condition, her response was carefully measured. "The wound appears consistent with an accidental fall against a sharp edge," she stated with clinical authority. "Given Eleanor's emotional state this evening, it's possible she injured herself during a moment of distress rather than being deliberately attacked." This suggestion of self-inflicted injury drew immediate attention from Margaret Mills Ashford, whose legal training made her sensitive to such distinctions. "Doctor, are you suggesting Eleanor harmed herself intentionally? That seems rather extreme even for someone disturbed by historical events." The exchange prompted Geoffrey Hartwell to lift his head from his hands, his confusion evident as he struggled to reconcile his confession with the evening's more recent violence. When pressed by Margaret for specifics about his alleged crime, his words carried the weight of genuine remorse mixed with long-suppressed fear. "It was embezzlement," he admitted quietly, his voice barely audible above the murmur of remaining villagers. "Small amounts over several months, but enough to ruin my reputation if discovered. Catherine found discrepancies in the church accounts. I handled the banking for several parish organizations. She confronted me privately, demanded I return the funds immediately or she would expose everything. She said she couldn't marry Thomas Whitmore with such dishonesty, casting shadows over both families." Miss Marple noted how this revelation cast Catherine Mills in a new light. Not as a victim of random violence, but as a young woman of strong moral principles who had discovered corruption in her trusted community. The embezzlement provided Hartwell with genuine motive, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about who else might have been affected by Catherine's threatened exposure. While the others focused on Hartwell's confession, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to a detail that had been overlooked in the evening's drama. Near the base of the harvest display, partially concealed by fallen wheat stalks, lay a small strip of fine muslin fabric. The material was pale and delicate, trimmed with the sort of careful hemming found in ladies' undergarments. But what caught her interest was the nature of the tear, perfectly straight, as though cut with surgical precision rather than torn in struggle. The discovery prompted her to examine more carefully the trail of wax droplets leading from the display toward the side door near the organ. The residue was definitely tallow rather than the beeswax Mrs. Thornfield had provided for the festival. Opaque, crumbly drippings that spoke of household candles brought for clandestine purposes. Someone had required additional light for activities the festival's illumination couldn't support. Mrs. Vivian Cross, who had maintained her restless pacing throughout the evening's revelations, finally approached the group with visible agitation. Eleanor spent considerable time these past weeks asking questions about Catherine. she offered, her usually sharp voice carrying an uncharacteristic tremor. She visited the library, examined old newspapers, spoke to anyone who remembered those days. Perhaps learning about the past affected her more deeply than we realized. Reverend Blackwood's response to this observation was telling. "Eleanor never mentioned any particular interest in historical research to me," he said carefully, his hands fidgeting with the sleeve of his dark overcoat. She seemed more concerned with present circumstances and current relationships within the parish. Miss Marple's keen eyes noted how the vicar's coat, draped over a nearby chair, bore a small stain on the lower hem, a pale, waxy residue that matched the tallow droplets on the floor. More significantly, caught in the fabric near the collar was a single thread of grey wool, fine and expensive, that corresponded exactly to the material trapped in the vestry doorframe. As the official investigation proceeded around Hartwell's confession, Miss Marple found herself increasingly certain that the evening's violence had been carefully orchestrated to coincide with Margaret's arrival and investigation. Eleanor's injury, while genuine, served a specific purpose in forcing long-buried secrets into the open. But the true architect of tonight's drama remained hidden behind a facade of pastoral concern and community leadership. The harvest moon continued its silent vigil over St. Bartholomew's, illuminating a mystery that had grown far more complex than a simple confession could resolve. In the flickering candlelight, with shadows dancing across guilty faces, Miss Marple prepared to look beyond the obvious deceptions toward the uncomfortable truth that someone was determined to keep buried, whatever the cost to innocent young women who asked too many questions about the past. The church hall gradually emptied as villagers departed in hushed clusters, their whispered speculations trailing into the autumn night like smoke from extinguished candles. Miss Marple remained quietly observant, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision while she catalogued the subtle interactions that often revealed more than formal statements. The dramatic events had stripped away the usual village politeness, exposing the raw nerves and hidden anxieties that lay beneath Millhaven's peaceful facade. Mrs. Beatrice Thornfield approached with a tea tray, her practical nature asserting itself even in crisis. As she poured, her hands trembled slightly, betraying the evening's toll on her composure. "Such a night," she murmured, settling beside Miss Marple. "All those candles and still so much darkness." "Beeswax does burn cleanly," Miss Marple observed mildly, accepting her cup, "though tallow tends to smoke and drip rather badly." Mrs. Thornfield paused, her expression troubled. "How curious you should mention that. We never use tallow in the church. Timothy insists on proper candles for services, though I did fetch 2 household candles from our pantry last week in case of power failure. Now I cannot think where I placed them." Her voice carried the bewilderment of someone discovering an unsettling gap in their orderly world. Meanwhile, Margaret Mills Ashford had positioned herself near Geoffrey Hartwell with the strategic patience of an experienced barrister. "Mr. Hartwell," she said gently, "your confession spoke of Catherine's moral principles. Did she confront only you about financial irregularities, or was this part of a broader investigation?" Hartwell's response revealed the depth of his fear and confusion. Catherine had a very strong sense of right and wrong, and she was clever with numbers. After she spoke to me about the embezzlement, she hinted that my situation wasn't unique. She said there were other unaccounted-for funds, other irregularities throughout the village. She called it a rot at the heart of Millhaven. His voice dropped to a whisper. She intended to speak to someone in authority before her wedding, to expose everything. Miss Marple noted how this revelation affected the remaining villagers. Mrs. Vivian Cross had gone quite pale and was staring fixedly at her hands. Dr. Sarah Pemberton's professional composure showed distinct cracks, particularly when Margaret pressed for details about who else might have been involved in village financial management. "The various funds are overseen by a small committee," Reverend Blackwood interjected, his voice carrying forced authority. "Myself, Colonel Pemberton, Mr. Hartwell before his retirement, and for the ladies' auxiliary accounts, Mrs. Thornfield and Mrs. Cross. A trusted group, naturally. While this discussion continued, Miss Marple quietly examined the physical evidence that had been overlooked in the evenings. Drama. The strip of fine muslin fabric near the harvest display bore not only the surgical precision of its cutting, but also traces of lamp oil, the refined petroleum product used in medical instruments rather than household lighting. More significantly, the fabric carried a faint floral scent that she recognized as Eleanor Vance's preferred perfume. Dr. Pemberton returned from checking on arrangements for Eleanor's continued care, her medical authority intact, but her movements betraying underlying tension. "Eleanor remains stable," she announced, "but she continues to speak about protecting someone from consequences they don't deserve. She becomes quite agitated when anyone suggests her injury was deliberately inflicted." This protective instinct struck Miss Marple as profoundly significant. Eleanor's determination to shield someone from blame, even while injured and vulnerable, suggested deep emotional investment rather than casual concern. Combined with her weeks of historical research and her presence at tonight's violence, it indicated she had uncovered information that someone was desperate to suppress. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Reverend Blackwood's coat, draped carelessly over a nearby chair. The dark wool bore a distinct stain of pale wax on the lower hem, tallow, not beeswax, and caught near the collar was a single thread of expensive gray wool that matched exactly the material trapped in the vestry doorframe. When she mentioned these observations with innocent curiosity, the vicar's response was telling in its careful deflection. "I light candles frequently in my pastoral duties," he said, his hands fidgeting with his sleeves. "One cannot always control where wax might fall." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Though tallow has such distinctive properties, it burns quite differently from proper church candles, doesn't it?" As Sergeant Peterson concluded his preliminary investigation and prepared to escort Hartwell to the police station, Miss Marple reflected on the evening's true significance. The physical evidence painted a clear picture of careful staging rather than spontaneous violence. The punctured decorative gourd that had provided concealment, the strategically placed sickle with its theatrical bloodstains, the surgical precision of Eleanor's wound, and the convenient availability of medical supplies all suggested orchestrated drama rather than authentic crime. Geoffrey Hartwell's confession, however genuine his remorse over embezzlement, served as an elaborate distraction from more recent and dangerous truths. Someone had used Eleanor's research and Margaret's investigation as opportunities to create a compelling narrative that would satisfy official scrutiny, while protecting deeper secrets. The true mystery lay not in Catherine Mill's 25-year-old disappearance, but in understanding why someone was willing to stage violence and manipulate evidence to prevent that historical truth from emerging. In the flickering shadows of St. Bartholomew's, with the harvest moon casting silver light through ancient windows, Miss Marple prepared to unravel deceptions that connected past corruption with present desperation, where the fear of exposure had driven someone to increasingly dangerous measures to protect secrets that had festered for a quarter century. The grey dawn that followed the harvest festival brought with it the peculiar clarity that often accompanies the aftermath of crisis. Miss Marple made her way through Millhaven's quiet streets, noting how the village seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for the other shoe to drop. She had learned over the years that the hours following dramatic revelations often provided the most illuminating insights into human nature, when people's carefully constructed facades began to show their cracks. Her first destination was the vicarage, where Mrs. Thornfield admitted her with trembling hands and apologetic murmurs about the previous evening's chaos. "Timothy went out early," she explained, her voice carrying an odd emphasis that suggested she was repeating words rather than conveying truth. "He said he needed to pray about his sermon, but he seemed so agitated." Miss Marple's keen eyes immediately noted the disarray in the vicar's study. The parish strongbox, which Mrs. Thornfield insisted had been locked before the festival, now gaped open like a guilty mouth. More tellingly, the desk bore the flattened remains of a tallow candle stub and traces of what appeared to be cold cream with a faint rose scent. Eleanor's preferred perfume. "How curious," Miss Marple observed mildly, examining the scattered papers. Someone required light for activities that couldn't wait for proper illumination. Margaret Mills Ashford, who had joined them after her morning inquiries, knelt to examine the strongbox more closely. Opened with a key, not forced, she determined. Someone with legitimate access, or someone who knew exactly where to find it. The discovery of burned paper fragments near the lich gate, brought by Constable Miller, revealed tantalizing glimpses of correspondence that someone had desperately tried to destroy. Among the charred remains, Margaret carefully extracted a fragment bearing Catherine's distinctive handwriting. "Cannot be party to deception. Thomas must do what is right, for the child's sake, if not mine. I will speak to the vicar, if he will not." Mrs. Thornfield's gasp was audible. "The child," she whispered, her face draining of color. "Oh dear, there were such whispers back then about the previous vicar's family. Mr. Gale had a niece who came to stay and then didn't." Miss Marple felt the familiar tingle of recognition as pieces began falling into place. Eleanor's weeks of historical research, her protective instincts towards someone she felt didn't deserve consequences, her presence at the vestry during last night's violence, all suddenly took on new significance. The morning's investigations continued at Mrs. Cross's tea room, where the proprietress revealed information that cast Catherine Mills's disappearance in an entirely new light. Catherine wasn't just investigating Geoffrey's embezzlement, she confessed, her usual sharp confidence replaced by barely controlled fear. She'd discovered a systematic diversion of charitable funds involving Reverend Blackwood and Colonel Pemberton. She kept meticulous records in a small leather ledger, planning to present everything to the diocesan authorities. "And this ledger disappeared with Catherine?" Margaret pressed. "Everyone assumed so," Mrs. Cross replied, wringing her hands. "But what if someone made sure it disappeared? What if Catherine's research threatened more than just financial reputations?" The implications were staggering. Catherine Mills hadn't simply stumbled upon minor corruption. She had uncovered a network of deception that reached into the highest levels of village authority. Her threatened exposure would have destroyed multiple reputations and careers, providing motive for desperate action. Dr. Pemberton's arrival at the tea room, ostensibly to check on the aftermath of the previous evening's trauma, provided another piece of the puzzle. Her medical assessment of Eleanor's injury remained troubling, too precise, too surgical, suggesting either remarkable accident or considerable anatomical knowledge. "Eleanor continues to speak about protecting someone from consequences they don't deserve," she reported. "She becomes quite agitated when anyone suggests her injury was deliberately inflicted, but she also keeps asking for Uncle Timothy." The final revelation came when Constable Miller burst in with news from the hospital. "Eleanor Vance has been asking for the vicar by name," he announced breathlessly. "But here's the peculiar thing. She's been calling herself Eleanor Gale, and she says she has something urgent to tell him before it's too late." Miss Marple set down her teacup with quiet satisfaction. The pattern was finally complete. Eleanor wasn't simply a curious young woman investigating historical mysteries. She was the child Catherine Mills had written about, the niece who had come to stay with the previous vicar and whose existence had been carefully concealed for 25 years. Her research hadn't been academic curiosity, but a desperate search for the truth about her own origins and her mother's fate. Someone in Millhaven had killed Catherine Mills to protect secrets that went far beyond embezzlement. And now that same person was willing to harm Eleanor to prevent those secrets from finally coming to light. The Harvest Festival's dramatic confession had been elaborate theater, designed to satisfy official investigation while protecting the real murderer who had remained hidden for a quarter-century. In the grey, morning light With truth finally emerging from decades of carefully maintained deception, Miss Marple prepared to confront a killer who had proven willing to sacrifice innocent lives to protect their position in Millhaven's seemingly respectable community. The hospital room held an unusual gathering for such an early hour, but Eleanor Vance's urgent summons had drawn together the principal figures in what was rapidly becoming Millhaven's most significant crisis in a generation. Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner chair, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision while her keen eyes catalogued every reaction to the young woman's carefully measured words. Eleanor lay propped against starched pillows, her face pale but her eyes burning with the intensity of someone who had carried a burden far too long. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 25 years of carefully suppressed truth, directed primarily at Margaret Mills Ashford, who sat beside the bed with the careful attention of a barrister preparing for the most important cross-examination of her career. "My name is Eleanor Gale," she began, her words striking the assembled group like a physical blow. "Catherine Mills was my mother, though she never lived to see me born. She called herself Catherine Gale when she came to stay with my great-uncle, the previous vicar, after discovering she was carrying Thomas Whitmore's child." Mrs. Thornfield, who had accompanied them from the village, sank deeper into the visitor's chair with a soft gasp of recognition. Dr. Pemberton's professional composure cracked visibly, her hands gripping the medical chart with unnecessary force. Margaret Mills Ashford leaned forward, her legal training evident in how she processed this revelation that transformed her entire understanding of her sister's fate. "Thomas Whitmore abandoned her when she told him about the pregnancy," Eleanor continued, wincing slightly as emotion pulled at her bandaged side. "Mother came to Uncle Gale in desperation, but she was also in the midst of investigating systematic financial corruption throughout the village. She had discovered embezzlement involving Reverend Blackwood, Colonel Pemberton, and others. Detailed evidence she kept in a leather ledger, planning to expose everything before my birth." Miss Marple observed how this revelation affected each person differently. Mrs. Thornfield seemed genuinely shocked, her usual composure replaced by the bewilderment of someone discovering their world contained hidden chambers. Dr. Pemberton, however, showed signs of recognition rather than surprise, as though Eleanor's words confirmed suspicions she had long harbored. "Mother didn't disappear voluntarily." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as the truth finally emerged. "She was murdered 3 days before she planned to present her evidence to the diocesan authorities. Uncle Gale found her body in the vestry, along with her blood-stained ledger, but instead of reporting the crime, he panicked, terrified of scandal, afraid of being implicated in whatever corruption she had uncovered." The pattern was becoming devastatingly clear to Miss Marple. Catherine Mills hadn't been a random victim of violence. She had been a young woman whose moral principles and investigative abilities had made her a lethal threat to multiple people with significant reputations to protect. Her pregnancy had made her vulnerable, but her evidence had made her dangerous to those she intended to expose. Margaret's voice carried barely controlled emotion when she asked, "Eleanor, how did you survive? How did you come to live with the vicar?" Eleanor's response revealed the full scope of the deception that had shaped her entire life. Uncle Gale buried Mother secretly in the old section of the churchyard and told everyone I was a distant relative coming to help with parish duties. He kept Mother's ledger hidden in the vestry strongbox, too frightened to destroy it, but too terrified to use it. When he died 2 years ago, I found everything, her research, her letters, the truth about my identity. Dr. Pemberton stepped forward with visible reluctance, her medical authority masking what appeared to be deep personal distress. "Eleanor, what happened last night? Who attacked you in the vestry?" Eleanor's answer provided the crucial connection between past and present crimes. "The same person who killed my mother tried to kill me when I confronted them with her evidence. They've been watching since Margaret arrived, terrified that the truth would finally emerge. When I met them in the vestry with Mother's ledger, they attacked me with the same surgical precision they used on her 25 years ago. Miss Marple felt the familiar certainty that came when a case finally revealed its true shape. The previous vicar's actions had created the perfect cover for murder. By concealing Catherine's death and raising her child in secret, he had allowed the killer to escape justice while maintaining the fiction that Catherine had simply left the village of her own accord. In the sterile hospital room, with truth finally emerging from decades of carefully maintained lies, Miss Marple prepared to identify a killer who had hidden behind respectability and medical authority while innocent people suffered for their crimes. The harvest moon had witnessed a confession, but the true confession, the one that would finally bring justice to Catherine Mills and her daughter, was yet to be extracted from someone who had proven willing to commit murder twice to protect their secrets. The hospital room's sterile brightness seemed to intensify as Eleanor's words settled into the minds of those present, each person processing the implications of 25 years of carefully orchestrated deception. Miss Marple set aside her knitting with deliberate precision, her keen eyes moving systematically from face to face as she observed the subtle reactions that often revealed more than spoken words. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally assembled all the pieces of a complex puzzle. "Your account clarifies much, but it also raises a crucial question. You mentioned that your attacker demonstrated surgical precision, a very specific phrase for someone in distress. Most people would simply say they were cut or stabbed." Dr. Sarah Pemberton, who had been standing near the medical charts with professional composure, stiffened almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple noted how the doctor's hand moved instinctively toward her medical bag before stopping abruptly, as though catching herself in an unconscious gesture. "The precision of Eleanor's wound troubled me from the beginning," Miss Marple continued, her voice maintaining its gentle tone while her words carried increasing weight. "Too clean for accidental injury, too calculated for passionate violence. It suggested someone with intimate knowledge of human anatomy, someone who knew exactly how to create dramatic effect while avoiding vital organs." Margaret Mills Ashford, her legal training evident in how she processed these observations, leaned forward with growing understanding. "Miss Marple, are you suggesting that Eleanor's attacker was someone with medical training?" "More than suggesting," Miss Marple replied, her attention focused on Dr. Pemberton's increasingly rigid posture. "The evidence has been quite clear from the beginning, once one learned to interpret it properly. The lamp oil residue on the muslin fabric near the harvest display, for instance, not household oil, but the refined petroleum product used to maintain surgical instruments. The surgical precision of Eleanor's wound. The immediate diagnosis of accidental self-infliction that deflected investigation from deliberate attack." Dr. Pemberton's professional mask began to crack, revealing the strain of maintaining deception under increasingly direct scrutiny. "Miss Marple, I'm afraid your amateur detective work is leading you toward unfounded accusations. Medical training doesn't make one a murderer." "Indeed not," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But it does provide both means and opportunity that others lack. More significantly, it provides the knowledge necessary to conceal evidence of violence through professional authority. When you pronounced Eleanor's wound accidental, Sergeant Peterson accepted your medical opinion without question. Who, after all, would challenge a doctor's assessment?" Eleanor's voice, though weak, carried growing certainty as understanding dawned. "You were there that night, weren't you, Dr. Pemberton, in the vestry, but you weren't trying to help Reverend Blackwood bandage my wound. You were the one who inflicted it." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Dr. Pemberton's response revealed the calculating mind that had enabled her to maintain deception for 25 years. Eleanor was hysterical, threatening to destroy reputations with half-understood historical documents. I was attempting to calm her when she became violent. Her injury was the unfortunate result of her own agitation. Miss Marple's gentle persistence cut through this carefully constructed narrative like a scalpel through tissue. Dr. Pemberton, your explanation fails to account for several troubling inconsistencies. The tallow wax on Reverend Blackwood's coat hem, for instance, evidence that someone brought household candles for clandestine activities. The grey wool caught in the vestry doorframe, matching the expensive fabric of your winter coat. Most significantly, the systematic way you steered searchers away from Eleanor's actual hiding place, as though you knew precisely where she might be found. Margaret's legal training made her quick to recognize the pattern Miss Marple was revealing. Doctor, you had opportunity throughout the evening to plant evidence, to stage theatrical elements that would draw attention to Geoffrey Hartwell's confession. But what was your connection to my sister Catherine? What motivated you to harm 2 generations of women? Dr. Pemberton's composure finally began to crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence and persistent questioning. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the strain of someone who had carried a terrible burden for far too long. Catherine Mills was an idealistic fool who couldn't understand the complexities of village life. She discovered financial irregularities, yes, but she also uncovered something far more dangerous, evidence of medical malpractice that would have destroyed not just my career, but the reputation of this entire community. The confession, once begun, seemed to pour from her like water from a broken dam. The previous doctor was elderly, increasingly unreliable in his diagnoses and treatments. I was young, ambitious, determined to establish myself professionally. When his mistakes resulted in patient deaths, I covered for him, falsified records, ensured that suspicious deaths appeared natural. It was meant to be temporary, just until I could establish my own practice properly. Miss Marple observed how this revelation affected each person in the room differently. Mrs. Thornfield seemed genuinely horrified, her faith in village institutions shattered by the scope of professional misconduct. Eleanor's face reflected not just personal grief, but the terrible understanding that her mother had died, trying to expose systematic corruption that had cost other lives. Catherine's investigation was far more thorough than anyone realized. Dr. Pemberton continued, her professional authority dissolving into desperate justification. She had identified patterns in death records, discrepancies in medical reports, evidence that would have triggered a formal investigation. Everything I had worked for would have been destroyed, along with the reputations of everyone involved in the financial irregularities she was documenting. Margaret's voice carried barely controlled emotion as she pressed for the complete truth. So you killed her to protect your medical career and your co-conspirators in the embezzlement scheme. I confronted her in the vestry, where she kept her evidence, Dr. Pemberton admitted, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I tried to reason with her, to make her understand that exposing everything would destroy innocent people along with the guilty, but she was adamant. She said the truth was more important than protecting reputations built on deception. The full scope of the tragedy was becoming devastatingly clear. Catherine Mills had died not as a random victim of violence, but as a young woman whose moral principles had made her a lethal threat to multiple people with significant secrets to protect. Her pregnancy had made her vulnerable, but her evidence had made her dangerous to those she intended to expose. When Eleanor began investigating her mother's disappearance, asking questions, examining old records, Dr. Pemberton's confession continued, I realized that the truth would eventually emerge. Her research was following the same patterns as Catherine's, leading toward the same dangerous conclusions. The Harvest Festival provided perfect cover for eliminating another threat, while deflecting suspicion toward convenient scapegoats. Miss Marple's final observation tied together all the threads of deception that had entangled Millhaven for a quarter-century. You encouraged Geoffrey Hartwell's confession, knowing his genuine guilt over embezzlement would make him a credible suspect for murder. You staged the theatrical elements, the blood-stained sickle, the dramatic discovery in the vestry, to create a compelling narrative that would satisfy official investigation while protecting your deeper secrets. In the sterile hospital room, with truth finally emerging from decades of carefully maintained lies, the true cost of Dr. Pemberton's crimes became clear. 2 generations of women had paid the price for one person's determination to protect professional reputation at any cost, while an entire village had lived under the shadow of unresolved crime and systematic corruption that had claimed multiple innocent lives. The harvest moon had witnessed many secrets over the years, but none so dark as those finally brought to light in the confession made by Candlelight. A confession that revealed not just murder, but the terrible human cost of allowing fear and ambition to triumph over truth and justice. The hospital room held an unusual stillness as Dr. Pemberton's confession settled into the minds of those present, each person processing the devastating scope of deception that had infected their community for 25 years. Miss Marple observed the subtle transformations occurring before her. Margaret Mills Ashford's rigid posture reflecting barely contained fury mixed with profound grief, Mrs. Thornfield's face aging visibly as the trusted foundations of village life crumbled beneath the weight of truth. Dr. Pemberton sat with her hands folded in her lap, her professional mask completely dissolved, to reveal the desperate woman beneath who had committed increasingly desperate acts to protect secrets that had grown more dangerous with each passing year. When she spoke again, her voice carried the hollow quality of someone who had finally stopped running from the inevitable. The medical malpractice was always the real threat, she continued, her composure entirely abandoned. The embezzlement could have been explained away, covered up through careful accounting, but patient deaths resulting from falsified records, that meant criminal charges, professional disgrace, possible imprisonment. Catherine's investigation had identified at least 6 suspicious deaths over 3 years, all involving the elderly doctor's mistakes that I had helped conceal. Eleanor's voice, though weakened by her ordeal, carried new strength as understanding crystallized. My mother wasn't just documenting financial corruption. She was exposing systematic medical negligence that had cost people their lives. That's why her evidence was so dangerous, why you couldn't risk exposure even after all these years. Miss Marple's gentle voice cut through the tension with characteristic precision. The details revealed themselves gradually, once one learned to observe properly. The tallow wax on Reverend Blackwood's coat, for instance. Household candles you had borrowed for clandestine activities. The grey wool caught in the vestry doorframe, matching your expensive winter coat. Most tellingly, the surgical precision of Eleanor's wound, coupled with your immediate diagnosis of accidental self-infliction. Margaret leaned forward, her legal training evident in how she processed the revelations. You used Geoffrey Hartwell's genuine guilt over embezzlement to create a convenient scapegoat, encouraging his confession while staging theatrical elements to support a false narrative. Dr. Pemberton's response revealed the calculating mind that had maintained deception for decades. Hartwell's remorse was genuine, his fear of exposure real. When he began speaking about the past at the festival, I realized it provided perfect cover for eliminating Eleanor while deflecting suspicion toward historical crimes. The harvest display, the blood-stained sickle, the dramatic confession, all carefully orchestrated to satisfy official investigation. The arrival of Sergeant Peterson with Constable Miller brought formal conclusion to the confrontation. Dr. Pemberton offered no resistance as the charges were read, her earlier defiance utterly spent. As she was led away, her eyes met. Miss Marple's briefly, a look of desperate understanding, perhaps even grudging respect for the quiet woman who had seen through elaborate deceptions built on 25 years of carefully maintained lies. In the silence that followed, Eleanor reached for Margaret's hand with surprising strength. She tried to silence me just as she silenced my mother, but she underestimated the power of truth. Mother's evidence will finally serve its intended purpose. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with characteristic calm. Human nature is endlessly fascinating, my dear. People will go to extraordinary lengths to protect their reputations, their carefully constructed lives, but secrets, like weeds, have a tendency to grow until they choke everything around them if left untended. 3 weeks later, St. Bartholomew's churchyard received Catherine Mills properly, with dignity and truth finally restored. The bishop conducted the service, while Eleanor stood with Margaret, wearing a black coat that fit poorly but beautifully. Geoffrey Hartwell, charged appropriately for embezzlement rather than murder, wept without shame. Mrs. Thornfield kept the tea-urns steady despite her trembling hands, while Colonel Pemberton maintained stoic silence about his own complicity in the cover-up. Reverend Blackwood had submitted his resignation the morning after Dr. Pemberton's arrest, his letter to the bishop confessing his cowardly silence about suspicious deaths and financial irregularities. The parish would heal, but slowly, under new leadership committed to transparency rather than convenient blindness. Life in Millhaven resumed with the careful deliberation of a community learning to trust again. The tea room reopened, conversations gradually returned to normal topics, and the Harvest Festival would be remembered not for its dramatic confession, but for the truth it finally brought to light. Miss Marple sat by the village green, her knitting needles moving with methodical precision as she reflected on the case's resolution. "People are not so very complicated," she had told Margaret before her departure. "They will do almost anything to preserve the picture they have of themselves. Sometimes that picture is worth keeping. Sometimes it needs to be broken. Your sister tried to break a false one, and you finished the work." The harvest moon continued its silent watch over Millhaven, but now it illuminated a community finally free from the shadows of long-buried deception. Truth, like grain properly separated from chaff, had found its way to light at last. In the gentle evening air, with candles flickering in cottage windows throughout the village, Miss Marple smiled quietly to herself. The confession made by Candlelight had yielded its proper harvest, not just justice for the dead, but hope for the living to build something better on foundations of truth rather than convenient lies. The weeks following Dr. Pemberton's arrest settled over Millhaven, like morning mist gradually clearing to reveal a landscape forever altered. Miss Marple remained at the Lamb and Flag, her presence accepted with the quiet gratitude reserved for those who bring uncomfortable truth to light. The village moved with the careful deliberation of a community learning to trust again, each conversation weighted with new awareness of how thoroughly deception had infected their daily lives. The healing of individual hearts. Eleanor Gale, she had reclaimed her mother's surname with quiet dignity, spent her mornings at Catherine's properly marked grave, where Geoffrey Hartwell had planted foxgloves with trembling hands. His gesture of penance spoke more eloquently than any formal apology could have managed. The embezzlement charges would see him serve a modest sentence, but the terrible burden of suspected murder had lifted from his shoulders like a stone rolled away from a tomb. "I wanted to confess something," he had told Miss Marple one afternoon, "but I confused wanting to tell the truth with wanting to bear someone else's guilt. Fear makes fools of us all." Mrs. Vivian Cross discovered that honesty, however belated, brought unexpected relief. Her tea room gradually resumed its role as the village's informal center, though conversations now carried a different quality, more genuine, less performative. The sharp edges of her personality had softened, tempered by the recognition that her silence had contributed to decades of concealed corruption. Colonel Pemberton appeared at Miss Marple's table one grey morning, his military bearing diminished but not destroyed. "I signed documents I should have questioned," he admitted quietly. "I told Thomas Whitmore to leave when I should have encouraged him to stay and face his responsibilities. I believed I was protecting the regiment of village life, but I was only protecting my own comfort. Institutional reckoning and reform." Margaret Mills Ashford's legal expertise proved invaluable as the investigation expanded far beyond Millhaven's borders. The diocesan authorities, initially reluctant to confront systematic failures, found themselves compelled to institute comprehensive reforms of rural medical oversight and financial accountability. Catherine's meticulous documentation had revealed not just local corruption, but patterns suggesting similar problems throughout the region. The Medical Council has initiated reviews of rural practices spanning 3 counties, Margaret reported to Miss Marple during one of their regular consultations. Mother's evidence was just the beginning. Dr. Pemberton's cooperation has exposed a network of professional negligence that cost dozens of lives over the years. Eleanor's recovery brought with it a fierce determination to ensure her mother's work finally achieved its intended purpose. Working alongside Margaret, she organized Catherine's research into a comprehensive report that would serve as the foundation for new protocols governing rural medical practice and parish financial management. Reverend Blackwood's resignation letter, read aloud by the visiting curate, spoke of moral failures and the corrosive power of institutional fear. His departure left a void that Mrs. Thornfield filled with characteristic practicality, organizing support groups for families affected by Dr. Pemberton's negligence while maintaining the church's daily operations with quiet competence. Community rebuilding. The process of rebuilding trust proved more complex than any individual healing. Villagers found themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine, wondering what other secrets might lurk beneath familiar facades. Yet this skepticism, initially uncomfortable, gradually evolved into a healthier demand for transparency and accountability. Mrs. Thornfield discovered strength she hadn't known she possessed, transforming her grief over her husband's failings into purposeful action. "We cannot undo the past," she told the parish council, "but we can ensure the future rests on firmer foundations than polite silence and willful blindness." The annual harvest festival, when it came the following year, would be forever changed. The new priest, a soft-spoken woman with an orderly mind and an insistence on open books, spoke of light used honestly rather than hidden in shadows. The congregation sang with voices that had learned the difference between comfortable lies and difficult truth. Letters from the past. Among the most poignant discoveries were Thomas Whitmore's letters, found hidden in the tea-room's wainscoting where someone, perhaps the previous vicar, perhaps Mrs. Cross herself, had concealed them from Eleanor's searching eyes. The correspondence revealed a young man's desperate attempts to return and claim responsibility for his child, his letters growing increasingly frantic as Catherine's disappearance became accepted fact. Eleanor read them with tears that mixed grief for her mother with unexpected compassion for the father she had never known. Thomas had died in Montreal 5 years earlier, still believing Catherine had left of her own accord, carrying his unborn child to some distant refuge where his letters could never reach her. Miss Marple's departure. On the morning of her departure, Miss Marple sat in the vicarage garden with Eleanor and Margaret, her knitting needles moving with their familiar rhythm while she reflected on the case's broader significance. "Your mother understood something that many people find difficult to accept," she told Eleanor gently. "Truth is not always comfortable, but it is the only foundation upon which genuine peace can be built. Dr. Pemberton chose reputation over human life, again and again, until murder became simply another means of preserving her carefully constructed facade." Eleanor's response demonstrated the wisdom born of her traumatic journey toward truth. Mother died because she refused to accept that appearances were more important than reality. If her death teaches this community to ask harder questions, to demand real accountability rather than comfortable assumptions, then perhaps something meaningful can emerge from all this tragedy. Margaret pressed a small envelope into Miss Marple's hands. The first quarterly report from the Catherine Mills Memorial Trust, established to support rural medical oversight and financial transparency. The accounts were beautifully, deliberately dull in their meticulous accuracy. Final reflections. As the motor carried her away from Millhaven, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lessons of human nature revealed by candlelight in an ancient church. People often imagine that confession requires dramatic gestures, shouted admissions in darkened rooms, theatrical revelations before assembled crowds. But experience had taught her that truth more often emerges through accumulated details. A stain where wax should not be, a coat that has brushed the wrong shoulder, a sentence delivered half a beat too quickly. The harvest moon would continue its silent watch over Millhaven, but now it illuminated a community finally free from the shadows of systematic deception. The confession made by Candlelight had yielded its proper harvest, not just justice for the dead, but wisdom for the living to build something better on foundations of truth rather than convenient lies. In her experience, the most dangerous secrets were those that communities chose to keep from themselves, preferring comfortable fictions to uncomfortable realities. Catherine Mills had died trying to break such fictions, and her daughter had lived to see the truth finally triumph over the fear that had silenced it for 25 long years. The mystery was solved, the guilty punished, and the innocent finally at peace. But more importantly, a community had learned that some harvests are worth any cost, and truth, however long delayed, eventually finds its way to light. The winter morning was sharp and bright when Miss Marple returned to Millhaven for the dedication of the Catherine Mills Memorial Garden, a carefully tended space behind St. Bartholomew's where medicinal herbs grew alongside traditional English roses. The symbolism was deliberate and deeply felt. Healing plants cultivated in honest soil, beauty that required no concealment to flourish properly. A community transformed. Eleanor Gale stood beside the simple stone marker, wearing her mother's engagement ring, recovered from Dr. Pemberton's effects where it had remained hidden for 25 years. The young woman had found her true calling in transforming her mother's meticulous documentation into powerful instruments of change. Working alongside Margaret Mills Ashford, she had established the Catherine Mills Memorial Trust, which now operated across 3 counties, providing oversight for rural medical practices and support for those who dared to speak uncomfortable truths about institutional failures. Mrs. Thornfield, who had aged gracefully into her role as parish administrator, maintained financial records with a transparency that would satisfy even the most suspicious auditor. Honesty proves less burdensome than secrecy once one grows accustomed to it, she had told Miss Marple that morning, her practical nature finding expression in meticulously organized ledgers displayed openly for any parishioner to examine. Geoffrey Hartwell tended the memorial garden with the devotion of genuine penance, his hands trembling slightly as he pruned the rose bushes, a man who had learned the crucial difference between theatrical guilt and authentic remorse. His recent return from a brief but transformative imprisonment had brought him a peace that years of secret embezzlement had never allowed. Institutional healing and reform. The new vicar, Reverend Sarah Whitmore, Thomas's younger sister, who had requested the appointment upon learning of her family's tragic connection to Catherine, spoke briefly about the difference between secrets that protect and secrets that corrupt. Her presence represented a profound act of familial redemption as she worked to ensure that her brother's abandonment of Catherine would be balanced by her own commitment to the community he had fled. Margaret Mills Ashford brought news of the broader reforms Catherine's evidence had inspired. The Medical Council had implemented comprehensive oversight protocols for rural practices. Financial management required independent auditing, and the trust provided crucial support for whistleblowers facing institutional pressure to remain silent. Mother's documentation has prevented dozens of unnecessary deaths, Margaret reported with quiet satisfaction. Dr. Pemberton's cooperation from prison has exposed systematic failures that might have continued for decades. The complex legacy of Dr. Pemberton. The imprisoned physician remained a figure of complex emotions within the community. Her genuine medical skills had helped many villagers over the years, making her crimes feel like profound betrayal rather than simple evil. Miss Marple had visited her once in the prison library, where she worked cataloging medical texts with the same methodical precision she had once applied to concealing evidence. "I convinced myself I was protecting the community," Dr. Pemberton had reflected, her professional authority reduced to quiet contemplation. Each lie required additional lies. Each cover-up demanded more elaborate deceptions. By the time Eleanor began asking questions, I was so deeply committed to the false narrative that murder seemed logical. Her acknowledgement that logic and morality were not synonymous had come too late to prevent tragedy, but perhaps not too late to serve as warning for others facing similar temptations. Individual redemption and growth. Mrs. Vivian Cross had channeled her formidable energy into supporting the Memorial Trust, her tea room transforming from a hub of sharp gossip into a forum for genuine community discussion. The change in her character, from cutting remarks to careful listening, demonstrated how collective reckoning could soften even the most hardened hearts. Colonel Pemberton had quietly retired from public life, his military bearing permanently shadowed by regret over his complicity in maintaining comfortable lies. He spent his days tending a meticulous garden, finding solace in the honest growth of plants, a stark contrast to the twisted truths he had once helped cultivate. Miss Marple's final reflections. As the memorial ceremony concluded, Miss Marple found herself in quiet conversation with Eleanor beside Catherine's grave. The afternoon light filtered through ancient yew branches, casting gentle shadows across the garden where truth had finally taken root in soil no longer poisoned by systematic deception. "Do you think she would approve?" Eleanor asked, gesturing toward the carefully tended herbs and roses. Miss Marple's response carried the wisdom of someone who had observed human nature in all its complexity. "Your mother died because she believed truth was more important than comfort, justice more valuable than reputation. This garden, this trust, this community's commitment to transparency, they represent everything she fought for." Later, as the train carried her away from Millhaven, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring mystery of human nature. The case had provided another rich tapestry of human folly and resilience, demonstrating how the same impulses that drive people to terrible crimes can also inspire extraordinary acts of courage and redemption. Catherine Mills had chosen courage. Dr. Pemberton had chosen fear. The difference lay not in their circumstances, but in their willingness to accept that truth, however uncomfortable, remained the only foundation upon which genuine peace could be built. The harvest complete. In the gentle rhythm of the carriage, Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more, a small smile playing on her lips. Millhaven was breathing freely again, its air no longer thick with the suffocating weight of unacknowledged secrets. The village had learned that some secrets were too dangerous to keep, some truths too important to silence, regardless of the cost to those who preferred darkness to light. The confession made by Candlelight had yielded its final harvest, not just justice for the dead, but wisdom for the living to recognize that transparency, however initially uncomfortable, created stronger communities than those built on convenient lies. The harvest moon would continue its silent watch over Millhaven, but now it illuminated a village that had learned to trust the light, where candles burned honestly in cottage windows, and truth grew like well-tended roses in fertile, honest soil. The mystery was closed, the accounts finally balanced, and Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that Catherine Mills's courage had created something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of long-buried deception.